They say a wedding should be the happiest day of your life. For me, it started as the most humiliating. I stood there in front of hundreds of people, wearing a suit that suddenly felt too small under the weight of their stares. My bride's family whispered loud enough for me to hear, their laughter cutting through the music like glass breaking. "Doesn't even look like he belongs here," one uncle sneered. Another guest smirked, "Guess money really can buy you anything, even a husband." Every word burned. And the worst part? My bride stood silently, her eyes downcast, as if agreeing with them. The people I was supposed to join as family didn't just disrespect me, they made a spectacle out of it. I clenched my fists, swallowing the fire building in my chest. Years of lessons from my father echoed in my mind. "Son, true power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's in knowing when to act." So I smiled, just enough to mask the storm inside me. They thought I was beaten down, that I would just stand there and take it. But all it took was one text, just one message, and $860 million vanished in an instant. The first thing I noticed wasn't the music or the flowers, it was the light. It poured down from a chandelier the size of a small car, scattering diamonds across the marble like someone had cracked open the ceiling and let daylight spill in. The Carter estate looked exactly like the magazines promised: cathedral-high ceilings, gold reliefs curling around doorways, and a grand staircase that made people straighten their backs just to walk down it. I'd seen photographs. I'd heard stories. Still, standing in the middle of it felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone else knew their lines but me. I adjusted my cufflinks, plain steel, a gift from my dad when I graduated, and reminded myself to breathe. "Keep your shoulders loose," he'd say before a big moment. People mistake tension for guilt. I rolled my shoulders and looked out over a ballroom thick with money. Old money. Names that have a way of opening doors that look locked to everyone else. The kind of people who measure worth in last names and club memberships. The string quartet shifted from something classical to something showy. A waiter swept past with a tray of champagne flutes tall enough to look fragile. My bride, Olivia, was across the room under an arch of white orchids, her hand on her mother's arm. They were framed by a strategically placed floral wall and a $1,000 photographer with a lens that could see into the future. Olivia looked perfect, like she always did, hair in soft waves, satin gown falling like water, smile practiced to the right wattage. We caught each other's eyes. She gave me a small nod that could have meant anything. "Michael," someone said behind me, near my left shoulder. The voice was warm in the way a heat lamp is warm, technical, not human. I turned to find a man in a midnight tux and a tie so sleek it might have been painted on. "Welcome." He offered his hand. "I'm Thomas. We met at the tasting." We had not. But I shook his hand anyway. "Nice to see you again." "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, scanning me the way you scan a receipt, line by line, item by item. Before I could answer, his smile tightened. "Handsome suit. Is it bespoke?" "Off the rack," I said, because lying has a way of leaking into the room and perfuming everything with something sour. "Ah." He nodded once, filed it away, and lifted his chin. "Excuse me." Thomas drifted off like a well-tailored cloud. A cluster of women by the bar tilted toward one another. The oldest cupped a hand to her mouth and performed a whisper meant to travel. "He's sweet," she said. "Just a little plain." A younger one laughed. "Plain is generous." Their bracelets clinked together like wind chimes. I reached for a flute of champagne and caught my reflection in the elevator polish tray. 32, clean shave, neat hair, a jaw that looks more stubborn than sharp. My tie wasn't cheap. It just wasn't eager to scream about it. Neither was I. Olivia's mother, Margaret, broke from a conversation with a councilman and glided toward me, her gown the color of a storm cloud trimmed in silver. Everything about her moved as one piece: neck, shoulders, gazelle, as if even her posture had an entourage. "Michael," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. We're so thrilled you're here. We? I asked. Everyone. She glanced around as if searching for everyone to back her up. Do find your parents later. I'd love a photo. The gallery prefers balanced coverage. She tapped her phone. And perhaps tuck that little name tag away. We're doing minimalism this evening. I looked down at the tag the planner had clipped to my lapel. Michael Hayes, Jerome, and unpinned it. I put it in my pocket, next to my phone. Minimalism, I said. Got it. Wonderful. Margaret's smile lifted, then settled into place like a tiara. Oh, and one more thing: when the toasts begin, keep yours to 2 minutes. 3, if you must. People get restless. She didn't wait for my answer before turning to instruct a florist about a peony that apparently had the audacity to face the wrong direction. I found my best man, Nolan, near the dessert table pretending not to touch the macarons. He's the kind of friend who makes every room feel less formal. He nudged a plate my way. Try the lemon. It tastes like a rich person's apology. I took one. What does that mean? Looks perfect, disappears fast. He popped a pistachio macaron and lowered his voice. You doing okay? Fine, I said, and it was mostly true. I can take a joke. What's harder to take is a chorus. 1,000 small things, each too petty to call out on its own, forming something big enough to stand under. I scanned the room for my parents. Mom had found a chair near the dance floor and was adjusting a boutonniere that had done nothing wrong. Dad was at the edge of a conversation with a man explaining the difference between 2 champagnes like one of them had offended his family. 2 groomsmen approached Carter cousins, both tall, both built like they played a sport in a league with private jets. Mike, the taller one, said, like we were old friends. We're grabbing photos on the steps. The photographer wants symmetry. He looked me over. Do you mind standing at the end? It balances the shot. Sure, I said, because they weren't asking. On the staircase, the photographer arranged us like chess pieces. You, in front. N'other end. Yes. Chin slightly down. Less. Good. The flash popped, a strobe of approval. A bridesmaid wrinkled her nose at my boutonniere and whispered to another, it's cute. The other lifted an eyebrow. It's something. There are a dozen ways to be told you don't fit. Most use the same vocabulary, cute, sweet, nice. None of them mean what they sound like. They mean smaller than us. They mean grateful. They mean know your place. Nolan bumped my shoulder. Breathe, he said, mouth barely moving. I said. Just learning the choreography. What dance is this? The one where you prove you can stand still. He grinned. You always were good at that. A waiter arrived with a tray of oysters balanced like a magic trick. Oysters? He asked. One of the Carter uncles took 2 as if he were rescuing them from a bad neighborhood. He looked at me. You a seafood guy, son? Sometimes. Well, tonight you'll become one. He downed an oyster and pointed the shell at me. When you marry into a family like this, you develop a taste for certain things. He smiled at his own reflection in a window. We'll polish you up. My jaw worked once. I let it go. There's a choice point with every slight like that answer, and the conversation sprawls like ivy. Stay silent and it withers. Silence is a tool most people don't know how to use. They mistake it for surrender. They don't realize it can also be a boundary. Michael. Olivia called from the landing, the photographer already framing her in a rectangle of light. She descended toward me, all satin and sparkle, eyes bright. For a second, the room softened. She took my hands. You look good, she said, almost like a secret. Thanks. I searched her face for any sign that she'd heard the little cuts, that she'd seen the way they were testing the edges of me. If she had, she tucked it behind her practiced smile. The photographer posed us forehead to forehead, then cheek to cheek, then turned us to face the crowd like we were about to present a check. When we reached the bottom step, a cousin stepped in front of me with a grin and a phone. "Quick one," he said, already lifting it. He angled the camera low, which is how you photograph someone you want to make look foolish. "Say, upgrade." "Upgrade," I said evenly, and stared down the lens until he lowered it first. The quartet paused between pieces. The hum of conversation swelled. Somewhere near the bar, a man announced I worked in regional operations, a phrase that spread quickly because it sounds vaguely unimpressive. By the time it reached a cluster of pearl earrings, I was in logistics, which is acceptable when it involves private planes and suspect when it involves loading docks. People nodded like a case had been closed. My phone was a rectangle of weight in my pocket. I could feel it the way you feel a promise in your mouth before you say it. Not yet, I told myself. There's a rhythm to a room like this. If you come in on the wrong beat, you look like the problem. Margaret tapped a crystal with a fork. Voices tightened into attention. "Family," she said, smiling toward the ceiling. "Thank you for being here to celebrate our daughter," and she looked at me, then past me, as though the teleprompter were somewhere over my left shoulder. "Michael." Laughter tilted through the room. It wasn't cruel. It was casual. That's the thing about casual cruelty, it feels polite while it rearranges your insides. I smiled. My dad's voice walked through my mind, steady as a heartbeat. "Power isn't loud, son. It's knowing the hinge. Find the hinge. Wait for it. When it moves, you move with it." I slid my hands into my pockets, found the phone, and let my fingers rest along its edges like a pianist testing the keys before the first note. The chandeliers glittered. The cameras watched. I stood where they'd placed me, shoulders loose, jaw easy, practicing the oldest lesson I ever learned: hold the line until it's time. The toasts hadn't even started when the second wave of whispers began, sharper than the first. I could hear them the way you hear the hiss of a kettle, subtle at first, then unmistakable, until the whole room feels like it's boiling. Margaret Carter, Olivia's mother, didn't waste time. She slid up beside us, her perfume wrapping the air like a ribbon you can't untie. "Michael," she said sweetly, her tone carrying just far enough for nearby guests to catch it. "You must be proud your family only needed 2 tables. We were afraid we might not have room for all of ours." I felt Olivia stiffen slightly, but she didn't speak. Margaret's eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of someone who'd landed a clean blow in front of an audience. The guests chuckled politely, their laughter stacking into a wall I couldn't move through. "That's efficient," I said, keeping my voice level. "Less space to manage, more time to celebrate." She blinked once, not expecting me to hand her insult back wrapped in calm. But Margaret wasn't the kind to give ground. She turned to her circle of friends, women in glittering gowns and necklaces worth more than houses. "Efficiency," she echoed, raising her glass. "Michael will be efficient." The group laughed like it was a punchline only they understood. One of the bridesmaids joined in, eyes darting to my boutonniere. "Where'd you get that little flower?" "A grocery store bouquet," she whispered to the girl next to her, too loud for it to be private. They giggled, hands covering their mouths like conspirators. A groomsman added, maybe his family couldn't afford the floral upgrade. "You know, the premium package." The table erupted with muffled laughter. I pressed my lips together, fighting the urge to fire back. "Don't answer every jab," my father's voice reminded me. "Not every rope deserves your hands on it." Still, each laugh landed heavier than the one before. Margaret wasn't done. She raised her glass again, this time addressing the nearby guests as though the ballroom were her personal court. We Carters, she said proudly, believe in tradition, presentation, and legacy. We've always been known for refinement. She let her eyes linger on me just long enough for the implication to sting. I swallowed the champagne in my glass, the bubbles sharp on my tongue. Refinement, I repeated softly, setting the flute down on a passing tray. It does come in many forms, doesn't it? Her smile faltered for just a second, but the guests around her laughed anyway, eager to stay in her orbit. From the corner of my eye, I saw Nolami best man lean closer, muttering under his breath. They're circling like sharks, Mike. Don't give them blood. I nodded, straightening my posture. My silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. Still, the words bruised. As the string quartet shifted into another piece, two men at the bar began their own round of commentary. He's just regular, one said, swirling his scotch. No pedigree. No board memberships. Not even a country club tan. Regular, the other echoed with a laugh. That's generous. He looks like a regional manager from somewhere in the Midwest. Their laughter rippled outward. By the time it reached the tables near the dance floor, it had morphed into something sharper, doesn't belong, lucky break, won't last. I caught sight of my parents again, me mom adjusting a centerpiece she hadn't been asked to touch, my dad nodding politely in a conversation he clearly didn't care for. They didn't hear the jokes. Maybe that was mercy. But I heard every single one. I gripped the edge of my chair, letting the bite of the wood ground me. Endure, I told myself. Hold steady. Because I knew what they didn't, I wasn't just some groom marrying up. I wasn't an intruder in their polished little world. And when the right moment came, every smirk, every whisper, every insult would echo back to them louder than they could imagine. If the whispers and jabs from the guests cut me like paper, then Olivia's words felt like a blade pressed straight against the bone. It happened after the photos, when we finally managed to steal a corner away from the noise. For a moment, it was just Usher's satin dress brushing against my suit, the murmur of the party fading into the background. I thought maybe she'd tell me she noticed, that she hated the way they were treating me, that she'd stand with me against it. Instead, she looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael, she whispered, maybe you could try a little harder. Just polish yourself a bit. You know. For them. The words landed heavy, heavier than any champagne glass or smirk in that room. You mean for you? I asked quietly. Her eyes flicked down, then away. I just don't want people talking. But they already were. And her silence in the face of it had been its own kind of answer. Across the room, Margaret laughed loudly at something the councilman said, her voice slicing through the music. She raised her glass again, always raising her glass, as though she could baptize the room in her control, and announced, here's to our daughter Olivia. And here's to her husband to be a man who is very, very lucky. Laughter followed, thick and heavy, rolling across the tables like a tide. I saw shoulders shake, heads nod, lips curl. A chorus of agreement. Olivia didn't protest. She lifted her glass too, eyes fixed on her mother. For a second, I thought she might add something, maybe a word of defense, maybe a correction. But she only smiled, faint and fragile, as if she had no choice but to go along with it. My chest tightened. That's when it hit me, the woman I loved wasn't just failing to protect me. She was quietly aligning herself with them, inch by inch, moment by moment. Behind us, one of the Carter uncles leaned to another, loud enough to carry. You can dress him up, but you can't rewrite his roots. He'll always be from wherever he's from. His friend chuckled. Well, at least he's marrying up. That's a talent, right? The laughter bubbled again, sharper this time. Each remark circled me like vultures, swooping in and pulling back just before tearing flesh. I tried to ignore them, tried to focus on Olivia. But she was already drifting away, answering the calls of bridesmaids who wanted another round of photos. When she looked back at me, her smile was polite, rehearsed, like I was just another guest she had to keep happy. I felt my fingers curl into my palm. I forced them open again. Patience, I told myself. Endure a little longer. From the stage, Margaret's voice rang out again. Tonight is a celebration of tradition, of legacy, of the Carter name. And with Michael joining us, we hope he learns the values that have carried us for generations. Learns, she said. Not shares. Not ads. Learns. The message was clear, I wasn't bringing anything to this table. I was just here to take lessons, to sit quietly and absorb. My father's voice echoed again in my memory, son, never argue with people who want to shrink you. Just remember who you are. And when the moment comes, remind them too. I exhaled, long and slow. The tide was still rising. And if Olivia's family wanted to drown me in their disdain, they were about to learn that tides can turn. Because the moment was coming. And when it did, no toast, no smile, no practiced cruelty in that room would be enough to save them. It happened gradually, like a storm building over calm water. The chatter grew sharper, the laughter more pointed, until suddenly I realized I was no longer just an outsider, I had become the evening's entertainment. It started with a stumble. One of the Carter cousins, tall, broad-shouldered, a grin that never seemed to stop, slapped me on the back as I walked past him. A little too hard, a little too well-timed. My foot slipped against the polished marble, and I lurched forward, catching myself on the edge of a table. The sound of clinking glasses and startled gasps filled the air, and then came the laughter. A wave of it, rolling across the ballroom like applause. Careful there, someone called. Don't want the groom to trip before the vows. Guess balance isn't part of the Hayes family traits, another voice added, followed by more laughter. My ears burned, but I forced myself upright, straightened my jacket, and let the noise wash over me. I smiled a thin, practiced smile as though I'd joined in on the joke. Inside, though, my chest tightened. Every laugh was another stone on my shoulders. The father of the bride, Richard Carter, chose that moment to step close. His champagne glass gleamed under the chandeliers. He leaned in, his words pitched just loud enough for those nearby to catch. Listen, son, he said with a smirk. Don't embarrass us tonight. Just stand there, smile, and let us handle the real work. The us hung in the air like smoke. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, toward his empire of allies, investors, politicians. I wasn't included in that circle. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I clenched my jaw. My hands itched to close into fists, but I kept them loose at my sides. Don't rise to it. Not yet. The laughter didn't stop. In fact, it grew bolder. A group of groomsmen gathered near the bar, raising their glasses. One called out, "Hey Michael, did you bring your resume tonight? You'll need it if you want to stay at this table." Another chimed in, "Careful, don't ask him about stock, she might think you're talking about cattle." Phones came out. Cameras lifted. Guests began recording as if I were a circus act put on for their amusement. I caught sight of one of Olivia's bridesmaids angling her phone toward me, her lips curled into a smirk. "This is going straight to TikTok," she whispered, and her friend giggled. Every angle, every sneer, every phone screen trained on might was a trial by humiliation. I felt my father's lessons fighting for space in my head. Son, never let their laughter decide your worth. But another voice was growing louder, stronger, enough. Enough. Then Olivia's mother raised her glass again. Always her. She loved to punctuate cruelty with champagne. A toast, she declared, her voice ringing above the chatter. To our daughter, Olivia, who brings grace, poise, and legacy to this family. And to Michael, who, she let the pause stretch, her eyes sweeping over me, will grow into his role. With time. The room exploded with laughter and applause. Guests clinked glasses, heads nodding as though she'd said something profound instead of slicing me open in front of them all. I looked to Olivia. My bride. My partner. The one person who could have changed the air in the room with a single word. She stood beside her mother, her glass raised, lips pressed into a nervous smile. She didn't speak. She didn't defend me. Her silence was worse than the laughter. The sound around me blurred, voices overlapping into one cruel chorus. Lucky man. Not in our league. Hope he learns quick. Marrying up. It pressed against me, louder and louder, until it felt like my lungs couldn't pull in enough air. That's when I stepped aside. My hand brushed the edge of a chair, grounding myself. I lowered my head for a moment, not in defeat, but in focus. Every insult, every laugh, every sideways glance, each one carved a mark into my memory. My chest rose and fell. My heartbeat slowed, steady and deliberate. The time for silence was ending. They thought they'd broken me. They thought I was just some nobody they could mock without consequence. But what they didn't know, what not even Olivia knew, was that I had been holding a key all along. And with it, I could unlock a storm none of them were prepared for. And soon, very soon, I would. The laughter still rang in my ears, but I had stopped hearing the words. They blurred together now, one endless hum of superiority and smugness. I stood perfectly still at the edge of the ballroom, watching them circle like actors in a play they thought I didn't understand. My hand drifted to my pocket. The phone was there, cool and solid, like a secret no one in the room had the imagination to guess. I thought about my father again, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering the day he handed me the keys to Hayes Holdings. Power isn't about shouting, son. It's about deciding when to move. When you act, let it be final. I looked around at the room, Olivia's father boasting with his friends, Margaret leading another round of laughter, cousins holding up their phones as though humiliation were a sport worth streaming. Olivia herself was at the center of it, eyes downcast, sipping champagne like the cruelty wasn't happening just inches away. The weight inside me shifted. Enough. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering above the screen. My assistant's name glowed at the top of my message thread. All it would take was one phrase, one confirmation, and the world would turn upside down. I typed 2 words. Simple, clean, final. My thumb tapped send. No one noticed at first. To them, I was just another man staring at his phone, probably too insecure to join their jokes. The laughter swelled again, glasses clinked, the music played on. But then slowly it began. One man at the bar frowned at his screen. He tapped it, refreshed it, tapped it again. What the hell, he muttered. Across the room, a woman gasped as her phone buzzed with a flood of notifications. Another guest's face drained of color as his stock alert chimed over and over, each one worse than the last. The whispers started spreading like sparks. Is this real? Check the ticker. No, it can't be. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, my face calm, my shoulders steady. Inside, I could feel the room turning, a tide shifting direction with unstoppable force. Margaret Carter was in the middle of a toast when the first shout cut across her words. Carter Enterprises stock down 15%. She froze, her glass trembling in midair. Another voice, breaking news. $860 million deal cancelled, terminated without warning. The ballroom erupted. Guests fumbled for their phones, screens lighting up every corner of the room with the same headline. Hayes Holdings withdraws from $860 million joint venture with Carter Enterprises effective immediately. The laughter vanished. The music faltered. The air turned cold. Olivia's father staggered backward, his face ashen. No, that's not possible," he muttered, shaking his head. He spun toward a cluster of men in suits. "Call Adrian. Call someone. Fix this." Phones buzzed louder, alerts piling up, Carter stock plunging. Partnership collapse sends shockwaves. Margaret's voice cracked as she tried to laugh. A mistake. A glitch. It must be. But the terror in her eyes betrayed her words. I stood quietly, letting the silence of my presence weigh heavier than any declaration. Finally, Richard Carter turned to me, his face red, sweat beading at his temple. "Michael, tell them this isn't true. Tell them it's a mistake." I met his gaze, my voice calm, even. "No mistake." The room went still. Gasps spread through the guests. Olivia's bridesmaids lowered their phones, staring at me as if they'd just seen a ghost. The same cousins who had laughed about my boutonniere now stood frozen, their smirks wiped clean. Olivia herself stumbled forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael, what did you do?" I let the question hang there for a moment before answering. "What you all never cared to know." I paused, sweeping the room with my eyes. "I'm not here because I needed your approval. I'm here because I allowed it. And with one message, I've reminded you exactly where the power lies." Phones buzzed again. Another headline flashed across the screens. $860 million collapse sparks market frenzy, Carter's facing crisis. Margaret's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble. Richard slumped into a chair, staring at nothing. Olivia pressed a trembling hand against her lips. The same crowd that had mocked me minutes earlier now looked at me in stunned silence, as though the room itself had been struck by lightning. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. They had wanted a spectacle. Now they had one. And it had only just begun. The ballroom was no longer alive with laughter. It was heavy, trembling, brittle with shock. You could almost hear the silence breaking apart under the weight of 1,000 buzzing phones, stock alerts, and frantic whispers. Margaret Carter, so regal just minutes before, looked like she'd been carved out of stone, her lips parted, her eyes wide. Her hands clutched the edge of the table as though it were the only thing holding her upright. Richard, her husband, was pale, his champagne glass still in his hand though the drink had long since spilled onto the marble. And then the questions started flying. What just happened? Is this true? $860 million gone. Who did this? I didn't answer right away. I let the panic spread, let their questions twist into fear. For once, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. Adrian Cole, the Carter family's lawyer, shoved his way through the crowd, his slick hair damp with sweat. He looked furious, almost wild. "Michael, what is this nonsense? Hayes Holdings has no authority to—" He stopped mid-sentence, blinking rapidly. His face turned chalk white. Because in that moment, he remembered. He knew. I slipped my hand into my jacket and pulled out a plain silver pennon heirloom from my father. I held it casually between my fingers, rolling it once before tucking it back into my pocket. Then, slowly, I spoke. "It isn't nonsense," I said. My voice was steady, deliberate, loud enough to cut across the chaos. "The $860 million deal you've been parading around all night. The joint venture you've been bragging about for months." I let the silence stretch, their eyes locked on me. I was the other side of that deal. Hayes Holdings was the counterparty. And now, Hayes Holdings has pulled out. Permanently. Gasps swept across the ballroom like a wave. "You." Margaret croaked, her voice breaking. "You're lying." I met her gaze, calm as ever. "Am I?" "Then check your phones. Check the press releases. Check the stock market." Right on cue, another guest shouted, "It's all over CNBC. Carter Enterprises finished." Phones lit up again, frantic scrolling, screens held up to faces that drained of color. Adrian swore under his breath, fumbling with his own phone. Richard sagged deeper into his chair, gripping his temples. The guests who had mocked me the loudest were now the most afraid. One by one, they stepped back, as though my presence carried some kind of fire they didn't want to be caught in. A woman in a red dress whispered, "He was the power all along." Olivia stumbled toward me, her voice trembling. "Michael, why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her, really looked at Hermie Bride, who had stood silent while her family turned me into their evening's entertainment. The woman who had whispered that I should polish myself for them, not for her. "Because I wanted to see," I said softly. "I wanted to know if you'd stand with me when you thought I had nothing." Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Richard finally found his voice. "You can't do this," he barked, his face red now with desperation. "Do you have any idea what this means? Our company, our name might'll be ruined." "Your name," I corrected. "Not mine. You made your choice when you treated me like dirt. And choices come with consequences." The guests murmured, some nodding, others too shocked to move. Margaret stepped forward, her hand outstretched as though she could grab the words out of the air and shove them back into my mouth. "Michael, please," she said, her voice quivering for the first time that night. "You don't understand, this deal was everything. Without it," I cut in, "you'll finally learn what it feels like to be underestimated. Dismissed. Mocked." Adrian tried again, his tone more desperate now. "We can renegotiate. This was a misunderstanding. A silly evening joke. Surely you won't punish an entire family for a few careless words." I looked at him with something colder than anger. "You think this is about a joke?" "No, Adrian. This is about respect. Something none of you seem to think I deserved. Not until you saw your empire slip through your fingers." The room shuddered with whispers. Guests hurriedly excused themselves, slipping out through the doors, not wanting to be associated with a sinking ship. Their expensive shoes clicked across marble like a retreating army. Olivia reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her silence said everything. "Michael," Richard said again, his voice cracking now. "We'll make it right. We'll." I held up my hand. "You had your chance. Tonight you showed me who you really are. And I showed you who I really am." I turned slightly toward the crowd, my voice cutting through the room like glass. "Remember this, never confuse quiet with weak. Never mistake patience for surrender." Their eyes followed me, wide and fearful. The chandeliers still glittered, the music still played faintly in the background, but the air was different now. The Carter family had lost everything, not because I shouted, not because I fought, but because I acted. And as they stared at me, broken and stunned, I felt the calm settle over me like armor. For the first time that evening, I wasn't the outsider. I was the storm. The room had gone from roaring with laughter to trembling in silence, and then predictably it collapsed into pleading. The same mouths that mocked me now scrambled to twist their words into apologies. The same hands that pointed at me earlier reached out in desperation, as if contact alone might reverse what had already been done. Richard Carter rose first. His face was pale, his tie crooked, the champagne stain still spreading across his sleeve. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. "Michael," he began, voice shaky but loud enough for the closest guests to hear, we've made a mistake tonight. Harsh words, misunderstandings, nothing more. Let's sit, talk this through. The deal can still be salvaged." Margaret, usually so composed, pushed forward next. Her emerald gown shimmered under the lights, but the power in her eyes was gone. She clasped her hands in front of her chest, like a queen suddenly stripped of her throne. You have to understand, she said breathlessly. We thought we assumed we didn't know who you really were. Her words hit me harder than the insults had. Didn't know who you really were. That was the truth of it, wasn't it? Their respect was always conditional. It was never about me. It was about power. Exactly, I said evenly. You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out. Respect isn't supposed to be earned by a number on a contract. Margaret blinked rapidly, her lips trembling. She reached for my arm, but I stepped back. Then Olivia stepped forward. Her face, once polished and radiant, was streaked with mascara. Her hands shook as she reached for mine. Michael, she whispered, I didn't mean it. I was just nervous. You know how my family can be. I should have defended you. Please don't end this because of them. I love you. I looked at her, really looked. The girl I had thought would stand beside me when the world sneered had chosen silence. And now, her love sounded less like truth and more like survival. Love, I said softly, doesn't hide when the knives come out. She flinched as though I'd struck her. Behind her, Adrian the ever-confident lawyer was sweating through his shirt. He stepped forward, trying to paste on a smile. Michael, my friend, he said, his voice trembling, we can renegotiate terms. A bigger cut for Hayes Holdings. A public apology from the Carters. We can fix this. Just don't make a permanent decision. I turned to him, my voice flat. It's already permanent. A murmur of panic spread through the guests. One woman gasped into her phone as she read an update aloud. Carter Enterprises stock just dropped another 20%. Another man cursed, shoving his phone into his pocket and heading straight for the exit. One by one, the room began to thin, guests unwilling to go down with a sinking ship. Margaret's knees buckled slightly, and she dropped into a chair, her jeweled hand clutching at her pearls. Richard's face sagged, hollowed by the realization that his empire was unraveling in real time. Olivia's tears fell freely now, streaks across her cheeks. And I stood calm in the center of it all. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the wedding ring, and set it on the nearest table. The small band gleamed under the chandeliers, a silent punctuation mark. Gasps rippled through the room. I don't need this family, I said, my voice steady, echoing off the marble walls. All I ever asked for was respect. Tonight, you've shown me who you really are. And now, I've shown you who I am. The weight of the words settled over them. No one laughed. No one sneered. Only the sound of a crumbling empire filled the air. Buzzing phones, hurried footsteps, whispered panic. I turned toward the doors, the aisles suddenly clear as guests pressed back against the walls, creating space the way people do when something powerful passes through. My shoes clicked against the marble, each step measured, final. Behind me, Olivia cried out one last time. Michael, please. Don't walk away. We can start over. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. For the first time that night, I was no longer the groom they mocked. I was the man they feared losing. And they had lost me. The cold night air hit me like freedom the moment I stepped outside the Carter estate. Behind me, the ballroom was still alive with panic shouts, hurried footsteps, the relentless buzz of phones announcing the collapse of an empire. Inside, they were scrambling for answers, begging for mercy, trying to reverse the irreversible. But I no longer belonged to that room. My driver pulled the car around, headlights cutting through the dark. He opened the back door with a bow of his head, but I paused before getting in. For a moment, I stood there on the steps, looking up at the mansion. Gold trim, glittering chandeliers, 1,000 roses lined along the pathway. It had been built to impress, to intimidate, to remind people of their place. And yet, one text had brought it all crashing down. My phone buzzed in my pocket again. Notifications piled on top of each other, mails from business partners, alerts from financial media, messages from my board. Carter Enterprises in free fall. $860 million deal terminated. Richard Carter's empire faces collapse. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. The storm I'd set in motion was already raging. Sliding into the back seat, I leaned against the leather and closed my eyes. My father's voice returned to me, steady as ever, "Son, silence is a choice. And sometimes, it's the loudest voice you'll ever need." Tonight, I'd finally understood what he meant. The car pulled away from the estate. Through the window, I caught a final glimpse of guests stumbling out in their gowns and tuxedos, their faces pale with fear of association. No one wanted to be tied to a family sinking so fast. Already, the once proud Carters were a liability. Headlines would spread before sunrise. By morning, everyone in the city would know, the wedding that was supposed to bind two dynasties together had instead ended one. I thought about Olivia. Her face wet with tears, her hand reaching for me in desperation. For a fleeting moment, grief touched me. I had loved her, or at least, the version of her I believed in. But real love doesn't stay silent when you're being torn apart. Real love doesn't stand in the crowd and let the knives land. The grief passed, leaving clarity in its place. My assistant called, voice calm but urgent. "It's done. The rival firm is ready to take the deal. Hayes Holdings will come out stronger than ever." "Good," I said simply. "Move forward." Because that was what I had always been taught: move forward. Don't waste time looking back at doors that have closed. I slipped the silver pen from my pocket, rolling it between my fingers. My father had given it to me years ago, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a promise. "Write your own future," he'd said. And tonight, I had. The car wound through quiet streets until the mansion disappeared behind us. My shoulders loosened for the first time in hours. The weight of their laughter, their sneers, their betrayal, it was gone. In its place was something heavier, but steadier, the knowledge that I had acted, and that my action carried the weight of consequence. Tomorrow, the Carters would wake up to headlines they couldn't erase. Richard's name would be plastered across newspapers as the man who lost everything. Margaret would find her social calendar empty, invitations revoked, allies vanishing overnight. Olivia would face the fallout of silence, the question that would haunt her forever: why didn't you defend him? As for me, I didn't need their validation. I never had. I was still Michael Hayes. Son of a man who taught me patience. Heir to a company that I had quietly shaped for years. A man who knew that sometimes, the greatest power is restraint, and that one decisive action can change everything. The city lights blurred past the window. My phone buzzed again with news of the Carters' downfall, but I set it aside. Tonight wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It was about something simpler: respect. And respect, once lost, can never be bought back. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of the road steady me. For everyone who had ever been mocked, belittled, told they didn't belong, this night was a quiet promise. You don't need their approval. You don't need their applause. You're enough. And when the time comes, when patience gives way to action, you'll find that your silence was never weakness. It was the strongest weapon you ever carried. The Carter estate faded into memory. My story, however, was only beginning.